He stared at the dial. 134 degrees, unusually high. His eyes flitted over to the operator on his right, a woman named Janus. She was staring at the board in front of her, calmly scanning from left to right. He looked back at the dial. 134 degrees. He thoughtfully tapped the thick, rough glass of the dial, hoping this would cause the needle to fall back to the expected margins. It did not. Frowning, Second Lieutenant Ernie Trebuch stood up from his station. Walking over to the corner of the cramped, hot room, he stopped in front of a man sitting at a small, dense but organized desk. "Excuse me, sir, I'd like to reduce primary feed water by 10% in order to reduce pressure in the primary steam generator." Chief Reactor Officer First Lieutenant Grigory Kolchak thought for a moment, then wordlessly nodded. Trebuch returned to his post and reached forward to operate a lever mounted on the wall. This lever was small, made of slate-gray cast metal. To an outside observer, it would seem almost insignificant. On the contrary, to those inside this room, and indeed to those familiar with a Type II Orion-class pressurized water nuclear reactor, this lever was one of the most important controls of those covering the wall. A small block of text etched into the metal above the lever read, "Feed water control." Trebuch slowly and carefully lowered the lever, all the while watching the various gauges and dials in front of him. He suddenly became aware of a presence standing behind him. "What of the pressure, Lieutenant?" Kolchak said. He had gotten up from his desk and was now observing Trebuch intensely. "Observing now." Trebuch's eyes moved from the temperature dial to an arguably more important indicator, a digital numerical readout. Slightly above this readout was a label, once again etched into the slightly warm metal. It read, "Steam Gen Press." Presently, the number read 83.4 psi. Trebuch leaned in. He knew that the reactor was running too hard, and he thought, as he often did, of how easy it was to overlook safety in these matters. 100 psi. Too much steam makes too much pressure, he thought. Too high. Reducing the amount of hot water entering the steam generator should have gradually reduced the temperature in the boiler, and therefore the pressure as well. To Trebuch's horror, however, the opposite appeared to be happening. He spun in his seat to face Kolchak. "Sir, pressure spike in primary steam generator." Immediately, Kolchak spun into action. "Cycle the steam valves to the turbines. Perhaps we have a diversion." A diversion. When hot, high-pressure steam is moving too fast to properly enter the turbines, and instead flow over and through them too quickly. This creates bubbles of hot, high pressure. It was not an emergency per se, but just about as close to one as could be attained without the alarm sounding. Trebuch spun back to the controls. Using both hands, he grasped two key switches in front of him, labeled Steam Isovalve B and C respectively. With a click, he switched them both to the off position. Immediately, a low hum and a slight vibration filled the control room. After carefully counting 5 seconds, he switched both keys back to the on position. He looked hopefully at the pressure gauge. The rate of increase remained unchanged. "No effect." "Isolate the condenser," Kolchak ordered. "But sir, we haven't notified the pump room. The main feedwater pumps are still enabled." "Just do it." Reaching for the gray lever once again, Trebuch this time yanked it all the way down. A low gurgle filled the air. "Janus, shut down the reactor." "Shall I initiate the scram procedure, sir?" Janus asked, hands already flying over her controls. "No, not yet." Kolchak walked briskly back to his desk and picked up the phone there. He dialed. "Ishka, this is Kolchak. I need you to turn off the primary feedwater pumps immediately." A pause. "What? No, we've had a pressure surge. Attempting to isolate." He hung up the phone. Back at the controls, Trebuch looked on as the pressure gauge reached, then passed 93 psi. A red LED illuminated itself in front of him, casting light on a label reading high pressure. He knew that outside, a torrent of steam was now being automatically vented outside the hull as a last-ditch attempt to save the situation. 93, 94, 95. With each passing second, the number crept upward and upward. "Pressure now reading 95 psi and climbing," Trebuch yelled. It was getting hard to hear over the sounds of gurgling, grinding metal and hissing steam. Kolchak picked up the phone again. "Yes, this is Kolchak. I'm issuing a general emergency. Evacuate the pump room and turbine hall at once." He set down the phone and slapped a red button on the wall. At once, a shrill alarm sounded. "Janus, initiate scram procedure. We may not have control in a few minutes." Janus nodded, then removed a key from around her neck, sliding this into a port that turned it 90 degrees clockwise. With a click, a plastic cover popped open above a red, clearly marked button. Without hesitation, she slapped it. Instantly, a whine could be heard, terminating in a loud, metallic clunk. Trebyuk breathed deeply. There was nothing that could be done now. He turned his head to look at Kolchak. "Sir, would it be wise to—" was all he got before the explosion, or at least the simulated explosion. A voice came over the PA system. "End training exercise, remain at your stations, and a training representative will be with you shortly." Muttering profanities under his breath, Kolchak returned to his desk and sat heavily. He slammed his fist on the cold metal surface. Trebyuk turned back to the controls, which were now unpowered. He glanced at Janus. She had a small notebook out and was writing furiously. After a few moments, a door in the rear of the room opened and a uniformed officer entered. She had the air of a person who knows that she has power. Everyone around her does not, and who is completely fine with this arrangement. As she entered, Trebyuk and Janus clambered to their feet and snapped to attention. At his desk, Kolchak slowly rose and half-heartedly saluted. "Reactor Team 3, the woman said, glancing around the room. "You have failed this simulation." She pulled a sheaf of paper from her coat. "The reactor is rendered inoperable. Thanks to the evacuation order, those in the turbine hall and pump room are unharmed. Second Lieutenant Janus, you have been killed. Trebyuk, you are in critical condition with third-degree burns across your face and chest. Chief Kolchak, Janus shielded you from the brunt of the blast. You have first-degree burns across your arm." She cleared her throat. "The pump room and upper half of the turbine hall is completely destroyed. Fortunately for you, contamination is limited to the reactor vessel. Even so, the ship is crippled." She returned the paper to her coat. "Ma'am, we did everything right," Janus blurted out. Silence filled the room. The training officer slowly walked towards Janus, stopping just in front of her. "You did everything by the book, I'll give you that. Unfortunately, this was a problem that the book didn't cover." She turned to face the other two. "Does anyone know what happened?" Silence. "Nobody? Well, I'm not surprised. Don't feel bad, not many people get this their first try." She sighed, getting ready for some serious explaining. "All of your controls here are first run through the main reactor computer, as you know. That's the special thing about the Orion class. Well, we discovered a flaw a while ago with the computer. Sometimes, under very specific conditions, the computer receives a decreased feed water flow command. Rather than reducing the flow, however, for a brief moment it encounters an overflow error. This causes it to open the feed water supply valve completely. You know the result of that." For the first time, Kolchak spoke up. "Why the hell would that flaw be in the system? If we know about it, why has it not been removed yet?" The training officer chuckled. "We have fixed it. In all operational Orion-class reactors, this flaw is not in the system." "Then why?" "The point of this exercise is to train you on the unknown. What will you do when the unexpected happens? When an eventuality is so improbable that you haven't even read about it in the operations manual? You need to know that there will be situations that you haven't trained for. That can't be trained for. You need to know how to react. If you don't, the results could be catastrophic." The room was silent, each person considering this perspective in their own way. After a moment of silence, the training officer continued. "As you all know, this failure will be marked on your official records. Unfortunately for you, one more, and you will have failed this course." For the first time, she cracked a slight smile, a cross between a smirk and a grin. "Fortunately, the next assessment will be the last. If you pass, you will be certified reactor operator in the service of the Qajar, eligible for service in the Imperial Navy." A poignant pause. The training officer took a breath and continued. "For now, you have completed your assignment. Grab something to eat, and then report to your quarters. Your work schedule is cleared for today." She saluted the room, then turned crisply and exited the room. Kolchak sighed. "You heard her. Get some chow, rest up. Think through today, so that you might be better prepared for tomorrow." He walked towards the door. Turning back, he surveyed the room. "Don't be too hard on yourselves. Nobody could have predicted this." He exited the room. Trebyuk turned to Janus. "What could we have done?" Janus pursed her lips and thought. After a moment she spoke. "I suppose we should have reset to local control. That would have disabled the automatic computer and given us manual control of the feedwater pumps. Either that, or shut down the core early. The shim rods were on automatic control, as were the mains. Switching to local control would have given me more ability to rapidly cool the core." Trebyuk nodded. I used to be in the pump room of the boiling water reactor in Hinka. We would always make sure that the levels were correct before doing anything with the pumps, regardless of what the computer said. Sounds smart. It was. Saved our asses more times than one. Trebiuk ran his fingers through his hair. Thick and greasy, the dark brown locks surrounded his thin, pale face. Though a young man of 22, Ernie Trebiuk was not inexperienced in nuclear reactors. He had graduated from his 10 years of mandatory study with a burning passion for the sciences, and was soon enrolled in Kajar Orkiyev College for the Sciences. He was immediately recognized for his wit and determination, graduating a full year ahead of schedule. At age 20, he was offered a job at the Volochev K. Nerny Nuclear Power Station in Hinka City. He found it to be exciting, if not exhilarating, work, creating huge amounts of electricity out of seemingly nothing but a hunk of dull, gray rock. His career, like many of his generation, was cut short by the outbreak of the war. Near the middle of the year, when the snow began to lightly fall across the countryside, and the streets of Hinka were buzzing with activity, the ambassador from the Greenache Empire was murdered in his hotel room, shot by a hard-right extremist. Tensions between the two burgeoning empires were already high, and this was the last straw. Despite countless apologies and promises from the Volkari imperial ambassador, and indeed the Qajar himself, war was declared later that same week. The country had been thrown into turmoil. Trebiuk could still remember the day well. He was at home preparing dinner. He lived alone and was not expecting company, so when a sharp knock on the door broke through the sizzling and bubbling of the stove, he was surprised. His surprise turned into an indescribable sinking feeling when he opened the door and saw the crisply uniformed officer standing on the other side. It was explained to him that his country needed him, that he was one of the finest young reactor technicians in the nation. It was a bald-faced lie, and both men knew it. The Navy needed operators for their reactors, so nearly every pump room mechanic, rod operator, and fuel refiner was being drafted. It was only another week before he was setting his lightly packed duffel on the floor of the barracks. For the next month, his life was nothing but training. Emergency drills, reactor operation, naval procedures, much more than could reasonably be fit into just 1 month. He snapped himself out of his reminiscing. "We should head down to the grub hall. There might be something good this time," Janus scoffed. "Has there ever been anything good?" "I suppose not." They shared a chuckle. Standing up, Trebiuk flipped one final switch on his console. With a low hum, the panel before him powered down, the many gauges and dials going dark. With Janus following, they shuffled out of the room. Outside, they were hit by the cold winter air. Inhaling sharply, Trebiuk briefly surveyed the scene before him. The simulation room was standing in the center of the training complex. To their left was the administration building, which itself was next to the storeroom. The electrical room, with its many transformers and breakers, stood opposite it. T0 the right was a long row of squat gray-white buildings. These were the barracks. Farther along the row was a longer building, the mess facility. Attached to this was the rec room, a cramped, humid excuse for a gym that reeked of old leather and sweat. Dividing the two halves of the base was a paved road, currently covered with around 2 centimeters of snow, that served as the only way to bring materials or supplies in or out. This road proceeded through a gate at one end of the facility, itself being the only entrance or exit to the base. The base was surrounded by a high chain-link fence. Trebiuk stared down the road. He knew that only a few kilometers away was the coast and the naval station. On a clear day, you could sometimes see the smoke billowing from the smokestacks of the diesels. "Are you going to stand there all day, looking at the sea, or do you perhaps want to eat?" Janus said, prodding him in the back. "Yes, you're right." They began walking down the road. Their breath billowed in front of them. It reminded Trebiuk of the steam that would flow from the cooling towers at the Hinka plant. As they walked, drawing their too light coats close to their bodies, they passed a group of soldiers, huddled in a clump. Their voices were low. "One thing I never understood about the military," Trebiuk said, turning to Janus, "is all the secrecy. I understand that keeping certain things from the Granichans is important, but why here?" Janus chuckled. "It's because we're civilians." Trebiuk furrowed his brow, confused. "We're not civilians. We're in the Royal Navy." Janus shook a finger at him. "We were civilians working in the nuclear field. An honorable thing to do. Then this whole mess started. The Army, Navy, and Air Corps has been at it for 2 years now. What have we been doing in that time? We've been here, going from one heated room to another, reading about physics and turning knobs. From their perspective, she jerked a thumb at the clump of soldiers, we're no more in the military than your old Oma. They walked on, turning off the main road and into the row of barracks. Trebuchet spoke up. That's an interesting perspective. I still think we're deserving of some respect, though. When we do get deployed, we'll be the ones keeping the lights on and the radar working. They were approaching the doors to the mess hall now, the glass covered in condensation from the heat inside. Janice pointed at them. You know why we never get anything good? Trebuchet shook his head. It's because of one simple reason. The country is running out of food. Most of the food is going to the military anyway, and if us, the so-called officers, are getting tasteless soup and dry bread, what do you think the soldiers on the front are getting? Probably a lot less than us, I'll tell you that. She pulled the doors open and briskly walked inside, leaving Trebuchet to mull this over in the cold. After a moment, he snapped out of his thinking and jogged inside after her,